You know, 8 weeks ago, I was struggling to find and share with you a path. I was trying to identify a route between what we were talking about as our absolute need to listen to marginalized voices within our society. And not really just listen, but to heed those voices. And the track that I was trying to cut started with this idea of privileged folks learning to hear marginalized voices, and then through some alchemy of compassion and empathy and love, we would land ourselves in a moment of reconciliation that I hoped we would recognize as our common humanity. You see, 8 weeks ago, I lived optimistically. I constructed my optimism around the idea that we humans were capable of reckoning our shared futures in the face of what seemed to be insurmountable, opposing historical evidence. I had begun to swim more easily with the ideas of Joanna Macy's Great Turning. You might remember we talked about that a few months ago. She has this triadic system of understanding our response to environmental disaster. She broke it into 3 areas: business as usual, the great unraveling, and ultimately the great turning. Just to recap, business as usual is nothing more than ignoring the great unraveling of our climate and consumptive realities. The great turning is our capacity to make change in how we live and how we organize ourselves for our shared future. Macy called it living with active hope. 8 weeks ago, I lived with active hope. That active hope included a sense that each of us, including all of us up here in this great northern small community, each of us had our own piece of work to do around reconciling social injustices. Each of us, 8 weeks ago, I heard challenges to that idea, to the work that we had to do, and they were stated in different ways. But most of all, folks were wondering, what can I do about these great issues of social injustice? So as I said, 8 weeks ago, I was clearing a pathway that would respond to those kind of challenging questions. My concern at that time was that it looked like the path was going to be based on pain. I kept coming up with pain as the portal to our common humanity. I was seeing that the pain of another is authentically received by our own receptors of pain, our own experience of pain, having cut the grooves in that would form the pathways for us to hear. It wasn't that our common humanity was going to be revealed through reasoned argumentation. The path to our common humanity that I was struggling to find and share with you was paved in pain. I wasn't sure at that time if a minister, even a layman, to lift up pain. Carol Grafford, someone many of you know, as a thoughtful, practicing Buddhist locally, shared with me after listening to me for about a half an hour that suffering is the first noble root of Buddhism. And as close as she could figure in that short period of time, I was landing in pretty much a pretty close starting place. And before talking with Carol, Linda Belote actually suggested that I read a book on the end of South Africa's rule of apartheid. It was written by Dr. Phumla Gobodo Madikizela. The book is entitled A Human Being Died That Night, Stories from South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Clearly, apartheid was organized, systemic injustice of the most violent kind. And post-apartheid truth and reconciliation process, that process started with folks who had been systemically marginalized becoming heard. Dr. Gobodo Monicazella wrote, "The power of human connectedness, of identification with the other as bone of my bone, through the sheer fact of his being human, draws us to rescue others in pain." Almost as if this were a learned response embedded deep in our genetic and evolutionary past. We cannot help it. We are induced to empathy because there is something in the other that is felt to be part of the self, and something in the self that is felt to belong to the other. Please, don't confuse her use of the word rescue, which she uses to identify an innate human motivation, with the condescending sense of rescue that diminishes the agency of another and presumes a continuation of unfounded superiority. As part of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Dr. Gobodo Monicazella spent hundreds of hours with perpetrators and victims of horrific violence during the era of South Africa's apartheid. And after being witness to all these stories, she lifts up the power of human connectedness through pain, authentically shared. It evoked a natural response of empathy. And she continued in her writing, empathy feels with the other in a reciprocal emotional process in which one asks for it, or his very situation seems to ask for it, and the other responds by offering it. For Dr. Gobodo Monicazella, it isn't exclusively the victims of violence who were worthy of empathy. The process of reconciliation in South Africa requires, and it's an ongoing process, and it still requires, an enormous effort on the part of the victims to forgive their oppressors. That's what she means when she says, empathy feels with the other in a reciprocal emotional process in which one asks for it, or his very situation seems to ask for it, and the other responds by offering it. If we are to respond to Macy's call for a shift in consciousness, a new way, not just of living, but of thinking and feeling, I think the shift in consciousness starts with learning to share and feel the pain of another. It moves naturally to empathy, and then finds as its product of that work reconciliation. The shift in our thinking and feeling recognizes our common humanity. Remember, Dr. Gobodo Monicazella's words, there is something in the other that is felt to be part of the self, and something in the self that is felt to belong to the other. That is the definition of common humanity. And the pain exacted by the injustice of apartheid needs to be shared. It needs to be heard, as we all can share and hear through our experience of pain to energize a justice-driven shared future. So Gobodo Monicazella's work left me energized and ready to share with you all that route between our absolute need to listen to marginalized voices within our society, that route that would land us in a moment of reconciliation that I hoped would be called our common humanity. That route was paved with pain. And then 7 weeks ago, I had a heart attack. Literally knocked to my knees by a searing pain in my chest. 5 days later, on my birthday, I had open heart surgery, followed by 6 weeks of active recovery. My family flew up to the UP one after another to help care for me. My KUUF family lifted me up over and over again, moving a recliner into my house while I was recovering in the hospital. Thank you for the recliner, by the way. And lifted me up again and again, night after night, with food. People came over with paintbrushes, painted my house. And with an overwhelming embrace that supported me as I reconciled my vulnerability in this life. It wasn't all that hard for me to recognize that other folks recognized my vulnerability and responded with active support because they had been there before. The grooves had been cut and their receptors ready, either by previous experience with a family member, a friend, or themselves. Our connectedness was, as Dr. Gobodo Monicazella wrote, the power of human connectedness, of identification with the other as bone of my bone, through the sheer fact of being human, me being human, draws others to rescue me in pain, in my pain, as if it were a learned response embedded deep in our genetic and evolutionary past. We cannot help it. I am grateful to be bone of your bone. This week, I am growing in certainty that vulnerability, our common existential sense of our potential for pain and suffering, is our path to hearing and understanding one another. I'm not optimistic about vulnerability's potential. I'm not actively hoping that vulnerability comes to full flower in each of us. I am certain of my vulnerability. And I am certain, in the last 6 weeks, I want to let you know that I have laid in some new grooves of my ability to hear others' vulnerability as well. I believe that our work is to engage our innate response to one another's vulnerability, both interpersonally and ultimately societally. And now, for me, it's not about hope. It's who we are. Thank you.